Long before Iran became a name that echoes through war rooms and headlines, it was whispered in the sacred halls of eternity. What if I told you that every missile launched, every threat declared, every alliance formed in the Middle East today was already written, not in the strategies of generals or the ambitions of kings, but in the ancient scrolls of prophecy, penned by hands that trembled under divine revelation? Iran, the very name sends chills through the corridors of power. Nuclear ambitions, proxy wars, threats against Israel that grow darker with each passing day. But here's what they don't want you to know: what has been hidden in plain sight for over 2 millennia. This was never just politics. This was always prophecy. Before Iran was Iran, it was Persia. And before Persia was an empire, it was a promise. A divine appointment written in the bloodlines of Noah's sons, carved into the visions of Daniel, and sealed in the prophecies of Ezekiel. The same land that once freed God's people from captivity is now destined to lead the final coalition against them. From the Garden of Eden to the gates of Jerusalem, from Cyrus the Great to the coming war of Gog and Magog, Iran's story isn't just unfolding in our headlines. It's been unfolding in God's timeline for over 4,000 years. You see, while the world watches Iran's nuclear program, God's people should be watching something far more dangerous: the fulfillment of ancient prophecy in real time. Because what's happening in Tehran today was foretold in Babylon yesterday. What we call current events, heaven calls scheduled appointments. The signs are no longer whispers, they are thunder. The alliances are no longer forming, they have formed. And the ancient enemy that once bowed before God's anointed king is now preparing for war against God's chosen people. But here's the question that will haunt you long after this video ends, the question that ancient prophets saw but dared not fully comprehend. What happens when a nation that was once God's instrument of mercy becomes his instrument of judgment? And what does that mean for every soul watching this unfold right now? The blueprint was written, the timeline was set, and Iran's biblical destiny is about to be revealed. Before empires rose, before prophets spoke, the soil of Persia already breathed prophecy. There is a moment in Scripture when eternity pauses, when the divine hand reaches down and plants seeds that will not bloom for 1,000 years. Genesis chapter 10. Most skip past it, another genealogy, another list of names lost to time. But what if I told you that hidden in those ancient bloodlines lies the first whisper of Iran's destiny? Picture this: the floodwaters have receded. The earth, washed clean of corruption, stretches before Noah's 3 sons like a blank canvas waiting for God's brush. Shem, Ham, and Japheth, not just survivors but architects of tomorrow's world. And in that sacred moment of new beginnings, 2 names are spoken that will echo through the corridors of prophecy for millennia. Madai, Elam, the sons of destiny, the fathers of Persia. From Japheth came Madai. His descendants would become the Medes, mountain warriors who carved their legacy in stone and snow, fierce, unyielding. Independent clans forged in the brutal highlands of what we now call northern Iran. These were not city builders. They were fortress dwellers, blood-bound tribes who knew that survival meant strength, and strength meant never bowing to foreign gods. But from Shem came something different. Elam, whose children would settle the fertile crescent of southwestern Iran, near the Persian Gulf. Unlike their mountain cousins, the Elamites became masters of trade, politics, and urban power. They controlled the ancient highways where caravans carried spices and silk. They built temples and palaces. They wielded influence like a weapon. 2 bloodlines, 2 spirits, 1 prophetic appointment. Do you see it? God wasn't just populating the earth, he was positioning the players. Every mountain settled by Madai's sons, every city founded by Elam's descendants, every alliance forged in those ancient valleys. All of it orchestrated by a divine hand that sees the end from the beginning. But here's where the story takes a chilling turn. These weren't just peaceful settlers expanding across the map. No, the first time we encounter Elam in Scripture, it's not as a neighbor, it's as an aggressor. Genesis 14, the first international war recorded in human history. And who leads the Eastern coalition sweeping down into Canaan like a storm of locusts? Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, 4 kings from the east, drunk on conquest, enslaving cities and taking captives. And among those captives, Lot, the nephew of Abraham, the man walking in covenant with the living God. Can you feel the spiritual tension? The descendants of Shem and Japheth, Iran's ancient fathers, making their biblical debut not as friends of God's people, but as their first enemies. But watch what happens next. Abraham, with only 318 men, launches a nighttime assault against this Eastern empire, outnumbered, outgunned, facing professional armies with nothing but household servants and divine favor. And he shatters them. This wasn't military genius. This was heaven declaring war. This was the Almighty drawing a line in the sand and saying, "Touch my anointed, and you touch the apple of my eye." This was the first prophetic message written in blood and fire. No power from the east, no matter how mighty, can prevail against those who walk in covenant with God. The mountains witnessed it. The rivers carried the news. And somewhere in the cosmic realm where angels keep the records, a pattern was established that would echo through every age. Iran and Israel, destined to dance the ancient dance of conflict and redemption across the stage of history. But don't think for a moment that God was surprised by Elam's aggression. Don't imagine that heaven was caught off guard by Persia's future hostility. Because the same God who planted Madai in the mountains and Elam in the plains already knew what they would become. He knew that one day their descendants would bow before a Persian king named Cyrus, who would free God's people from Babylonian captivity. He knew that their soil would nurture an empire that would rebuild Jerusalem's temple. He knew that from their loins would come wise men who would follow a star to worship the newborn King of Kings. And he also knew that in the final hour, when prophecy reaches its crescendo, those same bloodlines would rise again not as liberators, but as the spearhead of humanity's last rebellion against the throne of heaven. This is the mystery of Iran's origin, planted in providence, watered with purpose, destined for both glory and judgment. The seed was always there, dormant in the silence of Genesis, waiting for its appointed season to sprout. So when you see Iran in today's headlines, nuclear ambitions, proxy wars, threats against Israel, remember this. You're not just watching politics unfold. You're watching the ancient seed of Madai and Elam finally coming to full bloom, exactly as the divine gardener intended. What if your beginning is not small, just sacredly hidden? What if every mountain you climb, every valley you settle, every choice you make is part of a story that started long before you drew breath? What if your life, like Persia's, is not random but prophetic? But the first to rise would also be the first to strike God's covenant. The first war recorded in Scripture was not over land, but over covenant. Picture this. Somewhere in the ancient world, long before missiles carved the sky or nuclear threats darkened headlines, the earth witnessed its first international conflict. And at the heart of that battle stood a name that would echo through eternity, a name that today sends tremors through the halls of power, Elam. In Genesis 14, the scroll unfolds like thunder. 4 kings from the east had formed an unholy alliance. Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, the very soil that would one day birth Persia, that would one day become Iran, marched westward with a coalition of powers. They swept through the land like a locust plague, conquering cities, enslaving populations, and plundering everything in their path. But then, they made a fatal mistake. Among their captives was a man named Lot, not just any man, the nephew of Abraham, the one who walked in covenant with the Most High God, the one whose footsteps carried the promise of nations yet unborn, whose bloodline would father the Messiah himself. Do you see what just happened? This wasn't mere political expansion. This was spiritual warfare disguised as geopolitics. The descendants of Shem and Japheth, ancient forefathers of what we now call Iran, had just declared war against heaven's chosen. They had touched the apple of God's eye. They had dared to lay hands on covenant. And heaven took notice. When word reached Abraham, something divine stirred within him. Not strategy, not military counsel, not alliance building or diplomatic negotiation. No, what moved through Abraham's spirit was the same force that spoke worlds into existence, the same power that would one day part seas and resurrect the dead. With only 318 men. Think about that for a moment. 318 household servants against the combined armies of Eastern empires. By every calculation of human wisdom, it was suicide. By every law of warfare, it was impossible. But Abraham wasn't operating under human laws. He was operating under covenant. Under the cover of darkness, this small band of faithful men launched their assault. And what happened next defied every principle of military science. The Eastern coalition, with all their chariots, all their weapons, all their vast numbers shattered like pottery against stone. Abraham didn't just win. He devastated them. He rescued Lot. He freed the captives. He reclaimed the spoils. And he sent a message that would reverberate through the corridors of time. No power on earth can stand against the one who walks in covenant with the living God. But here's what makes this story prophetic, not just historical. Ancient Persia, modern Iran, learned something that night. They learned that there was a force in the universe greater than their armies, stronger than their ambitions, more terrifying than their wildest dreams of conquest. They learned that when heaven moves, earth trembles, and they would never forget. You see, that defeat wasn't just military. It was spiritual. It was the first crack in a foundation that would eventually crumble. It was the first glimpse of a pattern that would repeat throughout history. Whenever the enemies of God's people rise up in pride, whenever they touch what heaven has declared sacred, whenever they mistake God's patience for weakness, they fall. But here's the mystery that will haunt you. What if that first defeat wasn't punishment? What if it was prophecy? What if God allowed Elam to taste defeat so that generations later, when Persia rose to unimaginable power, they would remember? What if that night in the valley was meant to echo through the ages as both warning and promise? Because look what happened next. Look how the story unfolded. That same bloodline, those same descendants of Elam would one day bow before a Persian king named Cyrus, whom God would call my anointed. They would fund the rebuilding of Jerusalem's temple. They would escort God's people home from exile. They would become the unlikely instrument of Israel's restoration, from defeat to deliverance, from enemy to instrument. And yet, the story doesn't end there. Because if you trace that bloodline forward, if you follow that spiritual thread through the weaving of prophecy, you discover something chilling. The same soil that once challenged covenant, the same people who once tasted divine judgment, the same region that would later serve God's purposes, is prophesied to rise again. Not as deliverer this time, as destroyer. The wheel comes full circle. Ezekiel saw it. Daniel glimpsed it. The ancient prophets trembled as they recorded it. In the last days, Persia-Iran would once again march against God's chosen. But this time, there would be no small band of covenant warriors riding to the rescue. This time, God himself would rise from his throne. What if your first defeat was not punishment, but prophecy? What if every headline you read about Iran today, every threat they level against Israel, every alliance they forge in the shadows, what if all of it is simply the ancient pattern playing out again? What if the war that began in Genesis 14 never really ended, but only went underground, waiting for its appointed time to surface? What if we're not just watching politics unfold, but prophecy awakening? And though Elam fell that night in the valley, her bloodline did not vanish into dust. They waited, they watched, they remembered both their defeat and their destiny. And now, as the final act of history approaches its climax, they rise again not as covenant challengers this time, but as covenant fulfillment. Because sometimes God's greatest judgments begin with his greatest mercies, and sometimes the nations he uses to build his kingdom are the same nations he allows to test it. The blood spilled in that ancient valley still cries out today. The question is, are we listening? Centuries passed, and from forgotten tribes, a throne emerged. Picture this. The world has moved on. Egypt builds its monuments. Babylon grows fat with conquest. Assyria sharpens its claws. But in the rugged mountains of Media and the fertile plains of Elam, something stirs in the shadows. Not the clash of armies or the proclamations of kings, but the quiet gathering of scattered tribes who have no idea they are about to become the hammer of heaven. This is not the story of human ambition. This is the story of divine architecture. In the 8th century before Christ, While Israel groaned under the boot of foreign oppressors, God was already preparing their deliverance. Not through miracle or angel, but through the most unlikely instrument, a confederation of mountain clans who worshipped foreign gods and knew nothing of Abraham's covenant. Their names echo through the mists of time: Deises, the first to unite the Median tribes, a man who emerged from obscurity with a wisdom that seemed to transcend his pagan origins. Under his rule, the scattered became the strong, the forgotten became the formidable. And from the ancient capital of Ecbatana, a new power began to breathe. But this was merely the foundation. His grandson, Cyaxares, took that foundation and transformed it into something the world had never seen. He didn't just lead, he reformed. He reshaped the tribal warriors into a disciplined force so fearsome that when they marched against Nineveh, the very stones of that blood-soaked city trembled. And when Nineveh fell in 612 BC, one of Israel's cruelest oppressors collapsed beneath the weight of prophecy fulfilled. Do you see the pattern? While men saw politics, heaven saw preparation. From the highlands of Media came the Medes, fierce, independent, shaped by wind and stone into warriors who bowed to no empire. From the southwestern plains came the Elamites, ancient, proud, masters of trade and diplomacy who had learned to bend without breaking. Two peoples, two spirits, gradually weaving together into something that would reshape the known world. And in the shadows of their rising power, a young prince was growing. His name was Cyrus, though the world did not yet know that this name had already been whispered in the halls of eternity over a century before his birth. But here's what will make your spirit tremble. None of this was random. None of this was accidental. While these mountain tribes were learning to forge bronze and sharpen iron, the prophet Isaiah was already seeing their destiny. While they were building their first cities and establishing their laws, Jeremiah was already proclaiming their purpose. God was raising up Persia, not for its own glory, but for his own plan. Think about the divine irony. The same region that had once sent armies against Abraham's nephew Lot in Genesis 14, that ancient coalition led by Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, was now being shaped into the instrument that would free Abraham's descendants from captivity. From enemy to ally, from oppressor to liberator, from curse to blessing. This is how God writes history, not in straight lines, but in spirals that circle back through time, transforming ancient enemies into unexpected saviors. Could it be that God was demonstrating something profound about his character? That no people, no matter how far from covenant, no matter how steeped in idol worship, lies beyond the reach of his sovereign plan? That he can take the brass of human rebellion and forge it into gold for his purposes? As the Persian tribes multiplied and their influence spread, as their armies grew and their leaders matured, something magnificent was taking shape. Not just a kingdom, but a key. Not just an empire, but an instrument crafted in the secret places of divine purpose. The scattered were becoming unified. The weak were becoming mighty. The forgotten were becoming unforgettable. And all the while, in the dungeons of Babylon, God's people wept beside foreign rivers, wondering if their God had forgotten them. They could not see what heaven was preparing. They could not imagine that their deliverance was already taking shape in the mountains of Media and the palaces of Persia. This is the mystery of divine timing. While we see only the present moment, our tears, our trials, our seemingly impossible circumstances, God sees the entire tapestry. He sees the threads being woven together across continents and centuries, preparing answers to prayers that haven't even been prayed yet. What if I told you that your own deliverance might already be rising from ruins you cannot see? That God might be forging your breakthrough in places you would never think to look? That the very circumstances that seem to work against you might be the raw materials he is using to work for you? The Persians could not have known that their growing strength was actually heaven's mercy in motion. They thought they were building an empire. God knew he was building a bridge that would carry his people home. But here's the truth that will echo through every age. God's delays are not God's denials. His silence is not his absence. And sometimes, the longest night is just before the most glorious dawn. In those forgotten mountains and ancient plains, Among tribes who had never heard of Jerusalem or Abraham or the promise of a Messiah, God was writing the next chapter of redemption history. But Persia was not only made for war, it was destined to redeem. Before Cyrus ever breathed, heaven had already spoken his name. Picture this. In the halls of eternity, while empires rose and fell like waves upon the shore, God was writing a script that would shatter every human understanding of how he moves through history. 150 years before a Persian prince would take his first breath, the prophet Isaiah was given a vision so stunning, so impossible, that it would echo through the centuries like thunder across the mountains of time. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus. Anointed, Mashiach, Messiah, that sacred word reserved for the priests of Israel, the kings of David's line, the chosen vessels of the Most High. And now, inscribed by divine hand upon the soul of a pagan king who had never heard the name of Yahweh. Can you feel the scandal of it? Can you sense the trembling that must have seized Isaiah's prophetic heart as heaven tore open the veil of time and showed him this impossible truth? A foreign king, a worshiper of false gods, an enemy of the covenant people, called my anointed by the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But here's what makes this prophecy breathtaking. God didn't just name Cyrus. He detailed his destiny. Isaiah 45 reads like a battle plan written in the stars: every gate that would fall, every treasure that would be unlocked, every chain that would be broken. The prophet saw Babylon's doom before Babylon had even conquered Jerusalem. He witnessed the Persian Empire before Persia was more than scattered tribes in the mountains of Iran. I will go before you and level the mountains. I will break in pieces the doors of bronze and cut through the bars of iron. This wasn't just military strategy. This was divine orchestration on a scale that defies human comprehension. Fast forward through the centuries. The temple lies in ruins. Jerusalem weeps in exile. God's people sit by the rivers of Babylon, their harps hanging silent on the willow trees, wondering if the promises of their fathers were nothing more than ancient dreams. For 70 years, they waited. For 70 years, heaven seemed silent. And then, Cyrus. He rose from the highlands of Persia like a storm wind, uniting the fractured kingdoms of Media and Persia into a force that would reshape the world. One by one, the great powers fell before him not through brutality, but through something far more mysterious. It was as if the very gates of his enemies opened at his approach, as if the treasuries of kings emptied themselves into his hands, as if the God of Israel himself was clearing the path before his chosen instrument. When Cyrus stood before the walls of Babylon, the mightiest city on earth, something extraordinary happened. No siege engines, no months of starvation, no rivers of blood. The Euphrates was diverted, the river gates were left unlocked, and the Persian army walked into the heart of the empire as if they owned it. Because, in the deepest sense, they did. Heaven had already signed the deed. But the true miracle wasn't the conquest of Babylon. It was what happened next. Picture the scene. Cyrus, drunk on victory, holding the fate of nations in his hands. Every conqueror before him had done the same thing: enslaved the defeated, scattered the peoples, erased their cultures. But something stirred in the heart of this pagan king. Call it divine compulsion. Call it the whisper of eternity. Call it the fulfillment of a prophecy written before his bloodline even existed. Cyrus opened the prison doors, not just of Babylon, but of history itself. In a decree that still echoes through time, he proclaimed that the Jewish people could return to their homeland. But he didn't stop there. He funded the rebuilding of their temple. He restored their sacred vessels. He gave them royal protection for the journey home. Can you imagine the moment when the exiled Jews first heard those words? When hope, buried for 70 years under the rubble of Jerusalem, suddenly burst forth like a spring in the desert. When they realized that their deliverance hadn't come from within the covenant, but from without, from the most unlikely source imaginable? This is the mystery that should shake us to our core. God's greatest mercies sometimes come through the most unexpected hands. The same Persia that the prophets would later name as Israel's enemy was first Israel's liberator. The same empire that would one day threaten Jerusalem was the empire that rebuilt it. Ezra tells us that when the foundation of the Second Temple was laid, The people shouted with such joy that the sound was heard from far away. But mixed with the shouts of celebration were the tears of those who remembered the first temple. They wept because what they were seeing seemed impossible, that God could use a foreign king to restore what their own rebellion had destroyed. Cyrus never converted to Judaism. He never abandoned his Persian gods. He never walked in the courts of the temple he helped to build. And yet, his name is forever written in the sacred scrolls as the anointed of the Lord, a pagan king who became the instrument of divine restoration. Here's what should terrify and comfort us in equal measure. God's purposes are not limited by our categories. His mercy is not confined by our expectations. His instruments of deliverance can come from the most unlikely source, 7 from the hearts of those who do not yet know his name. What if the person you least expect carries the key to your deliverance? What if the nation you fear most is the vessel God intends to use for his glory? What if the enemy you've identified is actually the instrument of salvation you've been praying for? The story of Cyrus reminds us that God's sovereignty is so complete, so overwhelming, that he can write his will into the hearts of pagan kings and cause them to fulfill his purposes without even knowing they're doing it. It tells us that no empire, no matter how hostile, stands outside the reach of divine intention. But for every crown, there is a shadow, and for every Esther, a Haman waits. In a palace of gold, the fate of a people hung on the silence of a woman. Can you hear it? The trembling breath of an orphan girl standing at the threshold of a throne room, knowing that one step forward could mean death or deliverance for an entire nation. The year was 479 BC. The Persian Empire stretched like a golden chain from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces bowing before one throne. In the glittering capital of Susa, where marble pillars reached toward heaven and wine flowed like rivers, King Xerxes ruled with absolute power. His word was law. His law was death. But God had already hidden his answer in the shadows of that very palace. Her name was Hadassah, a Jewish orphan, no royal blood, no political connections, no army at her command. Just a young woman whose parents had been swept away by the tides of exile, raised by her cousin Mordecai in the refugee quarters of a foreign land. Yet something extraordinary was stirring in the invisible realm. Because while Xerxes thought he was choosing a queen for his pleasure, heaven was positioning a deliverer for his purpose. What if I told you that the most powerful throne in the ancient world was about to be turned by the trembling voice of a girl who had nothing but faith? But first came the darkness. In the shadows of that same palace, an ancient hatred was awakening. His name was Haman, descendant of Agag, heir to the Amalekite rage that had burned against Israel since the days of Moses. This was not mere political ambition. This was spiritual warfare, dressed in royal robes. When Mordecai refused to bow before Haman's arrogance, something demonic stirred. Haman's fury wasn't satisfied with punishing one man. No, he craved something far more sinister, the complete annihilation of every Jewish soul in the empire, genocide wrapped in legal decree, a final solution signed with the king's own ring. Listen carefully to the echo. The same spirit that whispered to Pharaoh to drown Hebrew babies, that hissed through Hitler to light the ovens, was now breathing through Haman's lips. The lots were cast. The date was set. In 11 months, every Jew from India to Ethiopia would be slaughtered like sheep. Their crime? Existing. Their sentence? Death. The decree went out in the king's name, sealed with royal authority, unchangeable as the laws of the Medes and Persians. Can you imagine the terror that swept through Jewish communities? Mothers clutching their children, fathers burying their treasures. Synagogues filled with the sound of weeping and the scent of ashes. It seemed as though God had forgotten his covenant people. But God never forgets. He simply works in ways that make angels tremble. Because while Haman was plotting in the palace corridors, Queen Esther, beautiful, beloved, and utterly hidden in her true identity, was about to discover why she had been crowned for such a time as this. Picture the moment. Mordecai, clothed in sackcloth and ashes, standing at the palace gates with news that would shatter a young woman's world. The message was simple, devastating, and divine. Your people are marked for death, and you are their only hope. But approaching the king uninvited, meant certain death. The golden scepter of mercy was extended only to those the king favored. For 30 days, Xerxes had not called for Esther. If she walked into that throne room unsummoned, she would be executed on the spot unless the king chose to spare her life. The choice was brutal: stay silent and watch her people perish, or speak truth and possibly die with them. This is where faith becomes fire. If I perish, I perish. 4 words that changed the trajectory of history. 4 words that revealed the heart of a woman who understood that some things are worth dying for. For 3 days and 3 nights, Esther fasted. Not just from food, but from fear. While her body grew weak, her spirit grew fierce. She wasn't just preparing to meet a king. She was preparing to wrestle with destiny itself. And then came the moment. Dressed in royal robes, perfumed with courage, Esther stepped into the inner court of the palace. Every footstep echoed like thunder. Every breath carried the weight of an entire nation. The king looked up, their eyes met, and in that breathless second, the golden scepter was extended. Heaven had moved a pagan heart, but Esther didn't rush. Wisdom wrapped in beauty, she invited the king and Haman to a banquet. Then mysteriously, she invited them to a second feast. She was learning to move in divine timing, to let God orchestrate the moments that would bring justice. At that second banquet, the mask came off. If we had merely been sold as slaves, Esther declared, her voice steady as stone, I would have remained silent. But a decree has gone out for my people, and for me to be destroyed. The king's face flushed with rage. Who would dare do such a thing? Esther turned, her finger pointing like a sword. Our enemy is this wicked man, Haman. In that moment, the hunter became the hunted. Haman fell to his knees, groveling for mercy from the very woman whose people he had sentenced to death. But justice was swift and ironic. The gallows he had built for Mordecai became his own place of execution. The plot he had crafted for Jewish destruction became the stage for Jewish deliverance. But the story wasn't over. Persian law was unchangeable even by the king. The original decree of death still stood, yet God's wisdom ran deeper than human law. Esther and Mordecai proposed a brilliant counter-decree: give the Jews the right to defend themselves. What was meant for annihilation became a day of vindication. When the appointed day arrived, the Jewish people rose up, not as victims, but as victors. The empire that was meant to become their graveyard became their fortress. Persia, the land of their exile, became the stage of their triumph. And so the Feast of Purim was born, an annual celebration that would echo through the centuries, reminding every generation that when hell plots annihilation, heaven prepares deliverance. Do you see the pattern? How God takes the very instruments of destruction and transforms them into vessels of salvation? But there's something deeper here, something that should make us tremble with holy awe. Esther's story isn't just about one woman's courage. It's about how God positions ordinary people in extraordinary places for divine purposes. That orphan girl, hidden in a foreign palace, carrying a secret that could cost her everything. She was you. She was all of us. Called to stand in impossible places, to speak truth in the face of power, to risk everything for the sake of righteousness. What if your current position, no matter how unlikely, how hidden, how insignificant it seems, is exactly where God needs you for such a time as this? The spirit of Haman still walks the earth today. It still hisses with ancient hatred against God's chosen people. It still plots final solutions and signs death decrees. But the God who raised up Esther still raises up deliverers. He still hides his purposes in the most unlikely places, in the most ordinary people. And sometimes, just sometimes, he crowns orphans to save nations. The throne room is still open. The golden scepter is still extended. And the God who turned a Persian palace into a Jewish fortress is still asking, who knows, but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. But Persia's destiny did not end in deliverance. It stretched into the stars. They weren't Jews, they weren't kings, but they bowed before the child, before anyone else did. Picture this moment, while Herod's palace plotted murder and Jerusalem's scholars remained silent. Strangers from a distant land crossed deserts and mountains. following a light that spoke to their souls in a language older than empires. Centuries had passed since Esther's miracle in the courts of Susa. The great Persian Empire had fallen beneath Alexander's swift sword, and Rome now ruled the world with iron fists and crucifixion nails. Yet in the shadows of history, something ancient stirred, not in the halls of power, but in the quiet chambers where scrolls were kept and stars were studied. Matthew 2:1-2 records it with stunning simplicity. Magi came from the east to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him." But who were these magi? The Greek word magoi reveals their identity: Persian priest scholars, heirs to a sacred tradition that stretched back through centuries of learning. These weren't casual stargazers or wandering fortune-tellers. They were the intellectual and spiritual elite of the East, men who had spent lifetimes studying the movements of heaven and the whispers of ancient prophecy. And here's what will shake you to your core. They likely carried with them the very scrolls of Daniel. Imagine the scene. Centuries earlier, a young Hebrew captive named Daniel had been dragged from Jerusalem's ruins into Babylon's glittering courts. But God had other plans. Daniel didn't just survive, exile conquered it. Rising to become chief of the magicians and wise men, he served not only Babylon but also the Medo-Persian Empire that followed. And when Daniel left this world, he left behind more than interpretations of dreams. He left behind a time-linear prophetic countdown that pointed directly to the arrival of the Messiah. Daniel 9:25 speaks it plainly. From the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Anointed One, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Could it be that these Persian magi had preserved Daniel's writings for generations? That they not only honored him as a prophet but took his words so seriously they calculated the very moment of Messiah's birth? The evidence suggests exactly that. Feel the weight of this revelation. These weren't men following superstition. They were following Scripture. They weren't chasing a random celestial event. They were watching for the fulfillment of ancient prophecy written by a Hebrew exile who had once walked their very halls. When that star appeared blazing with a light that seemed to pierce not just the night sky but time itself, they knew. The moment Daniel had foretold had arrived. The King of the Jews had been born, and they would not rest until they found him. But here's what makes their journey even more extraordinary. These men of status and comfort abandoned everything. They left behind their positions, their security, their familiar world. For weeks, perhaps months, they traveled across hostile terrain, through bandit-infested desert routes, guided only by a star and an unshakable conviction that heaven itself was announcing the arrival of eternity. And when they finally arrived in Bethlehem, dusty, weary, but burning with anticipation, they didn't come empty-handed. The gifts they brought were soaked in prophetic symbolism. Gold, declaring his royalty, this child was not just another baby, he was the King of Kings. Frankincense, used in priestly worship, acknowledging his divinity, this was God wrapped in human flesh. And myrrh, a burial spice, whispering of the sacrifice to come, this baby was born to die. Whether they fully understood the weight of their offerings, their journey revealed a divine mystery. Without knowing it, they were proclaiming that this child would be king, would be God, and would be the Lamb who takes away the sins of the world. But consider the stunning irony. While these foreign scholars from Persia knelt in worship, where was Jerusalem? Herod, seated on his stolen throne, was plotting infanticide. The religious leaders, who could quote every verse about Messiah's coming, remained just 5 miles away, unmoved and uninterested. The very people who should have been first to welcome their king were the last to recognize him. Yet these outsiders, these descendants of the empire that had once carried Israel into exile, became the first Gentiles to bow before the newborn Savior. Think about that. Persia, the nation that God had once used to free his people and rebuild his temple, was now the first to honor the arrival of his son. This was no coincidence. This was prophetic alignment. From Daniel's scrolls to Bethlehem's stable, Persia remained woven into God's unfolding plan. Even in exile, even far from the covenant land, God was stirring hearts, planting seeds, and preparing a nation once more to play its part in redemption's story. The Magi's worship wasn't just a beautiful Christmas scene. It was a preview of things to come, a glimpse of the day when representatives from every nation would bow before the King of Glory. Their journey from Persia to Palestine traced a path that millions would follow, from darkness to light, from seeking to finding, from prophecy to fulfillment. But here's the question that should burn in your heart. Would you have recognized the star? Would you have been willing to leave everything comfortable and familiar to follow a light you couldn't fully explain? Would you have traveled for months across dangerous territory, risking everything, just to kneel before a promise made flesh? Because that's exactly what these Persian sages did. They didn't just visit a baby, they witnessed the arrival of eternity into time. They didn't just offer gifts to a child, they participated in the cosmic moment when heaven kissed earth and God became man. The wise men from the East weren't just following a star. They were following the faithfulness of God, the same God who had promised Abraham that all nations would be blessed through his seed, the same God who had whispered Cyrus's name before he was born, the same God who had used a Persian queen to save his people from extinction. And in that moment, as they knelt in that humble stable, the full arc of God's faithfulness was displayed. Persia, the liberator, the protector, the seeker, once again became the first to recognize and worship the king. But what Persia honored in the beginning, she would rage against in the end. Daniel prayed, and the heavens went to war. There are battles you cannot see, wars fought not with swords, but with prayers. Not in palaces, but in the invisible realm where angels clash and demons scheme. And sometimes, when an old man kneels beside a river and refuses to eat for 21 days, the very foundations of empires tremble. This is the story Daniel never wanted to tell. The vision that left him weak, trembling, unable to speak for days. Because what he saw wasn't just the future of Persia, it was the dark machinery behind it. The unseen forces that move kings like chess pieces and nations like pawns across the board of eternity. Daniel 10, the 21st day. Picture it, an aging prophet, weathered by decades of exile, kneeling by the banks of the Tigris River. For 3 weeks, he had touched no choice food, no wine, no oils. His body was weak, but his spirit burned with desperation. Israel was still scattered. The temple lay in ruins. And somewhere in the silence between prayer and heaven, Daniel sensed a war raging that no human eye could see. Then, breakthrough. A being of terrifying glory appeared before him, face like lightning, eyes like flaming torches, voice like the sound of a multitude. And the words this messenger spoke would shatter everything Daniel thought he knew about the struggle between heaven and earth. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. Let that sink in. For 3 weeks, the exact time Daniel had been fasting and praying, an angelic emissary from the throne of God had been locked in combat, not with flesh and blood, not with armies or weapons, but with a dark territorial spirit. A demonic prince, so powerful, so entrenched in the spiritual realm over Persia, that heaven's messenger could not break through. This wasn't symbolic language. This was revelation. Heaven was pulling back the veil to show Daniel and us that nations are not merely political constructs. They are spiritual battlegrounds. Behind every throne sits another throne. Behind every king lurks another king. And the real war for the destiny of nations is fought in places where human eyes cannot see. The Prince of Persia, not Cyrus, not Darius, not any earthly ruler, but a demonic entity so tied to that empire's spiritual atmosphere that Scripture gave it Persia's very name. A fallen angel assigned to influence, to deceive, to resist God's purposes through the corridors of Persian power. And for 21 days, this prince had been winning. But then came Michael, one of the chief princes, the archangel whose very name means, "Who is like God?" And with Michael's intervention, the spiritual battle turned. The angelic messenger broke through. Daniel received his vision, and the future of empires was revealed. Can you feel the weight of this truth? While Daniel fasted, angels fought. While he prayed, principalities waged war. His intercession wasn't just personal devotion, it was participation in a cosmic battle that would determine the fate of kingdoms. But why Persia? Why did this ancient land become a fortress of spiritual resistance? Because Persia was never just another empire. From the moment Madai and Elam were named among Noah's descendants, this land was marked for divine purpose. God had plans for Persia, plans to use it as an instrument of judgment against Babylon, as a tool of liberation for his people, as a stage for displaying his sovereignty to the nations. And the enemy knew it. Satan, the ancient adversary, understood that Persia would one day serve God's agenda, so he positioned his forces accordingly. He assigned one of his princes to oversee that region, to influence its rulers, to corrupt its purposes, to turn God's instrument into his own weapon. This is the pattern we see throughout Scripture. Wherever God plans to work, the enemy works first. Wherever heaven intends to break through, hell builds fortresses. And Persia, destined to be God's unlikely servant, became ground zero for spiritual warfare. The prince of Persia never truly died. When Cyrus rose to power and issued his famous decree, was it purely his own decision, or had heaven's warriors finally broken through the spiritual resistance over that land? When Esther found favor with King Xerxes, was it merely her beauty and wisdom, or had the prayers of God's people finally overcome the dark powers seeking Israel's destruction? And today, as modern Iran rattles its sabers and threatens to wipe Israel from the map, are we witnessing merely political hostility, or is the same ancient prince of Persia, that territorial spirit that once resisted heaven's messengers, still whispering through the halls of power in Tehran? This is why prayer matters. This is why fasting shakes heaven. This is why the intercession of one righteous person can change the destiny of nations. Daniel didn't just receive a vision that day by the river. He participated in warfare. His 21 days of seeking God's face coincided perfectly with 21 days of angelic combat. His spiritual hunger became heaven's breakthrough. His refusal to give up became the key that unlocked divine revelation. What if the war you're feeling isn't around you, but over you? Every believer who has ever felt spiritual resistance, every intercessor who has ever wondered why prayers seem to hit a ceiling, every faithful soul who has pressed through weeks of seeming silence, you are Daniel by the river. You are participants in battles you cannot see, partners with angels you cannot touch, wielding weapons of prayer and fasting that shake principalities in heavenly places. The prince of Persia withstood heaven's messenger for 21 days. But he could not withstand the combination of angelic warfare and human intercession. He could not resist the power of a man who refused to stop praying until heaven broke through. And here is the mystery that should make every believer tremble with awe. The same God who sent Michael to break through demonic resistance over ancient Persia is still sending his angels today. The same heaven that fought for Daniel's prayers is still fighting for yours. The same spiritual authority that shattered the prince of Persia's grip on that empire is still available to those who will fast, pray, and refuse to give up until breakthrough comes. Because when princes fall in the heavens, kings rise on the earth. And the war over Iran, the spiritual battle for the soul of ancient Persia, far from over. The same land that once freed Jerusalem now marches to destroy it. There is a silence that comes before the storm. Not the absence of sound, but the terrible weight of what is about to break. And in the visions of Ezekiel, as he stood by the river Chebar in exile, that silence was shattered by a voice that pierced through time itself. Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog. The prophet's hand trembled as heaven unveiled what was to come, not just a war between nations, but the final chess move in a game that began in Eden. And there, written in letters of fire across the scroll of the future, was a name that would send chills through every generation that followed. Persia. Picture this, the same Persia that had once sent Cyrus to rebuild the temple, that had raised Esther to save her people, that had sent wise men to worship the newborn king, now stands as the spearhead of humanity's final rebellion against God. Ezekiel 38:5 doesn't whisper it. It declares it with the authority of thunder. Persia, Cush, and Put will be with them, all with shields and helmets. Iran, modern-day Iran, listed first among the coalition of the condemned. But this is no ordinary alliance. This is not the politics of man. This is the theater of the divine. Gog of Magog. Many scholars believe this points to the great bear of the north, Russia leads this unholy assembly, but Iran, ancient Persia, is the willing accomplice. The nation that once knew God's favor now marches under the banner of his enemy. Can you feel the weight of that reversal? The same soil that once produced kings who honored the God of Israel now breeds leaders who curse his name. The same mountains that echoed with the hoofbeats of Cyrus's horses of liberation now thunder with the war machines of annihilation. But why Iran? Why would the prophet see this particular nation in the vanguard of the final assault? Listen carefully to the spiritual mathematics at work. Iran today sits at the crossroads of 3 continents. It controls the gateway between East and West. It holds the key to the world's energy supply. And most chilling of all, it openly declares its intention to wipe Israel from the map. The ancient prophecy is not just being fulfilled. It is being fulfilled with precision that would make a Swiss watchmaker weep. Ezekiel saw Iran's nuclear ambitions before uranium was discovered. He saw proxy wars before the term was invented. He witnessed the arming of terrorist militias centuries before Hezbollah drew breath. Because what we call current events, God calls ancient appointments. They will come from the far north, you and many nations with you, all of them riding on horses, a great horde, a mighty army. Replace horses with missiles, tanks, and drones. Replace far north with the axis that now stretches from Moscow to Tehran. The prophecy doesn't just describe the future, it describes our present with terrifying accuracy. But here is where human plans crash into the immovable wall of divine sovereignty. Because Ezekiel's vision doesn't end with Israel's destruction, it ends with something far more terrible and beautiful: God's intervention. In that day, when Gog attacks the land of Israel, my hot anger will be aroused, declares the sovereign Lord. The earth will shake, fire will fall from heaven, the armies of Iran, Russia, and their allies will turn on each other in confusion. What was meant to be Israel's funeral becomes the world's wake-up call. Can you picture it? The generals in Tehran and Moscow, so confident in their superior numbers, their advanced weapons, their coordinated strategy suddenly helpless, as the God they mocked reveals who truly controls the chessboard of history. This is not just military defeat, this is cosmic humiliation, the creator of the universe stepping onto the battlefield to remind creation who holds the deed to the earth. But there is something deeper in Ezekiel's vision that should make every soul tremble, because this war is not just about Israel, it's about revelation. I will show my greatness and my holiness, and I will make myself known in the sight of many nations. Then they will know that I am the Lord. This final conflict is God's last sermon to a rebellious world. The nations gather to destroy his people, and in response, he reveals his glory in a way that leaves no room for doubt, no space for denial, no corner for unbelief to hide. Iran's leaders today mock the God of Israel. They call for death to America and death to Israel while funding terror in his name. But they do not realize they are marching toward their own divine appointment not with conquest, but with judgment. So let me ask you something that should pierce through the noise of our daily lives and lodge itself in your spirit. When this prophecy unfolds, and it will unfold, where will you be standing? Will you be among those who mocked the idea that ancient prophecy could intersect with modern headlines? Will you be caught off guard when the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob shows up to defend his covenant people? Or will you be among those who saw the signs, who understood the times, who prepared their hearts for the revelation of his glory? Because make no mistake, when Iran and her allies march toward Israel, they are not just marching toward a piece of real estate in the Middle East. They are marching toward the throne room of eternity. And every soul watching will have to choose. Will they bow before the God who judges the nations, or will they stand with the nations he judges? Ezekiel's vision ends with a cleanup that takes 7 years. 7 years to burn the weapons, 7 months to bury the dead. The land will be cleansed, but the memory will echo through eternity. Iran's destiny in this war is written. The outcome is sealed. But the spiritual significance reverberates through every human heart. When God's patience finally reaches its end, when his mercy is exhausted by mankind's rebellion, his justice falls like thunder. The same Iran that once served God's purposes will serve them again, not as a deliverer this time, but as an example, an eternal reminder that no nation, no matter how powerful, no matter how proud, can lift its hand against the Almighty and survive. But judgment is not the end of the story. There is one more twist buried in the dust of the prophets. Conclusion. And so the ancient scroll unfurls its final parchment, but the story it tells is far from over. From the mists of Genesis to the thunder of Revelation, we have traced a thread that refuses to break. A golden cord woven through the tapestry of time, connecting the sons of Noah to the headlines of today, linking the dreams of Daniel to the nuclear ambitions of Tehran. Iran, Persia, Elam, Madai, 4 names, one destiny. A nation that has walked every path known to the human heart, from obscurity to glory, from service to rebellion, from deliverance to destruction, and perhaps from judgment to redemption. Could it be that we have witnessed not just the history of a nation, but the biography of the human soul itself? We began in a garden where the descendants of Japheth first drew breath. We watched as Elam marched against Abraham, only to be scattered by the sword of covenant. We saw Cyrus rise from Persian dust to become God's anointed, rebuilding what Babylon had broken, restoring what exile had stolen. In the courts of Susa, we witnessed Esther's courage save a people from extinction. In Bethlehem's stable, we watched Persian magi bow before a baby whose star they had followed across deserts and decades. We trembled as Daniel unveiled visions of silver empires and raging bears, of rams charging and goats conquering. And in the prophecies yet to come, we saw Persia marching with Gog, her banners raised against Jerusalem, her destiny seemingly sealed in fire and judgment. But then, in the whisper of Jeremiah's scroll, we heard something else. Something impossible. Something beautiful. In the latter days, I will restore the fortunes of Elam. The God who breaks bows also mends hearts. As we close this sacred investigation, one question echoes through the corridors of time. What if Iran's story is not a tragedy, but a testimony? What if her rebellion is not the end, but the prelude to the most stunning redemption the world has ever witnessed? Think of it. The same soil that birthed Cyrus the Deliverer may one day produce worshippers at the Feast of Tabernacles. The same people who fund terror today may sing hosannas tomorrow. The same nation that threatens to wipe Israel from the map may make pilgrimage to Jerusalem's gates. Is this madness or is this mercy? Perhaps it is both. Perhaps it is the kind of divine madness that turns water into wine, death into life, enemies into family. The kind of mercy that remembers Egypt as my people and Assyria as the work of my hands. The kind of love that sees not just what is, but what could be. You who watch this are not mere observers of ancient history. You are witnesses to its fulfillment. You are living in the space between Daniel's visions and their completion, between Ezekiel's warnings and their manifestation, between Jeremiah's promise and its realization. Every headline from Tehran is a verse being written in real time. Every threat against Israel is a chapter unfolding before your eyes. Every underground church meeting in secret is a page being turned toward restoration. You are not watching prophecy. Prophecy is watching you. The question is not whether these ancient words will come to pass. The question is whether you will have eyes to see them when they do. Whether you will recognize the hand of God moving behind the veil of international politics. Whether you will pray for Persia even as she prepares for war. As the curtain falls on our journey through Scripture's hidden geography, we are left not with answers, but with awe, not with certainty, but with wonder, not with fear, but with faith in a God whose ways are higher than ours, whose thoughts are deeper than the oceans, whose mercy is newer than every morning. Iran's nuclear program may dominate the news. Her proxies may threaten the peace. Her leaders may speak of annihilation. But God speaks of restoration. And between those two voice own human, one divinilies the space where miracles are born. The same fire that once burned in Zoroastrian temples may one day burn on Christian altars. The same hands that now forge weapons may one day be raised in worship. The same voices that now threaten may one day testify. Because this is who our God is, the God of the impossible second chance. The God who turns rebels into revivalists, persecutors into preachers, enemies into evangelists. Saul became Paul, Rome became Christendom, and one day, perhaps, Iran may become something the world has never imagined. The scroll closes, but the story continues. And in the silence that follows, we are left with this holy certainty. In God's economy, every ending is a beginning, every judgment contains the seed of mercy, and every broken bow may become an altar of praise. Because in God's hand, even ashes can become altars, and Persia's flame may rise again, this time in worship.